City Council work session for May 19th. We have two items on our agenda. The first one is the City Charter, Section 5.1, and Eric, is this yours or is this Charlene's?
Well, I guess I'd like to introduce it, if it's all right.
Please.
Councilmember Hubach did bring it to our attention, but what we have determined after doing some research is that the City Charter Section 5.1 as published, meaning this is what you would see if you look at the printed version that's in our code or online, reads, the city manager may be removed on recommendation of the mayor with consent of 6 out of 8 members of the entire council. And so when Councilmember Hubach questioned whether in fact that was the correct wording, and we did some research, we did find that the wording that was approved by the voters in 1999 did read differently. It reads, there will be a city administrator appointed by the mayor with the advice and consent of 6 out of 8 of the members of the entire council. The city administrator may be removed with the consent of 6 out of 8 of the members of the entire council. The language regarding recommendation of the mayor is not included in the language that was approved by the voters. So city attorney has provided some information, and he does note that he did consult with Ernie Van Hooser, who was the former chairman of the Charter Commission. Mr. Van Hooser wasn't able to shed any light on again, why it is that we have a different version. He does suggest that there might be more than one interpretation of that wording, but regardless of that, it does seem to all of us, city attorney and myself certainly, that what was the language that was approved by the voters is the language that should be in the published version of the charter. I just simply wasn't willing to go and just do that without talking to council about it, making you aware of the situation, putting it on the record, and getting your indication of assent. So that's what we seek, is just direction to proceed with that and make that correction. Do you have any questions? Well, then that we will do that, and that'll be reflected in the minutes of this work session, and that will explain, if anybody is noticing, why the wording will change, even though it won't take any formal action by council to do that. Thank you.
Brings us to our next item, which is the requirement that city employees live within 35 miles of the city. And Eric, we'll kick that back to you.
Thank you, sir. Our current residency or our policy regarding requiring employees to live a certain distance with the city, from the city, does require that all employees live within 35 miles of the corporate limits of the city, or 35 miles from City Hall. And this was put in place quite a few years ago, and as for the reason for 35 miles, my understanding is that this is simply because at that time when a requirement was put in place that the employee lived the furthest away was 35 miles away, so that was set as the outside distance. This has actually caused a particular issue recently, and it did cause me to think about it and to recommend a change to you. I am recommending elimination of that 35-mile requirement for a number of different city positions while retaining it for others. I do think that certain positions are essential for purposes of this policy. I'll get into that in a second, but I do also think that there are other positions which are, all positions are of course essential to some degree, but that for purposes of needing to get in on short notice do not have that same urgency that other positions have. And I do think that in fact our requirement has caused some issues. As I noted in the memo, we do have one employee now who, due to circumstances which I do not believe he really contributed to, has had to move outside of the 35-mile limit. So he was inside the 35-mile limit when he was hired, but has had a need for personal reasons to move outside of that radius, and now the city is faced with having to discharge that employee, even though he's been performing acceptably, and simply because he moved outside of the 35-mile limit, and the position he occupies is not one of those that I would recommend we continue to have that requirement for. And then, as I also noted, at least we have had one employee within the last year who left us, but who indicated that if it had not been for that requirement, he would have liked to have stayed. So, you know, it seems to me that, you know, our interest, city's interest is in having the very best people that we possibly can working for the city. And if somebody is not essential and is willing to make that a longer commute, then in my view, that would be beneficial to the city, and we should amend the city's policy accordingly. So I have recommended a number of positions that we continue to keep that 35-mile requirement for. Most of those are public safety employees. The ones that I've listed include city manager, whose residency is already required within the city limits by the city charter, so that one almost doesn't count. Others that I've included would include assistant city manager, the public works director, the assistant public works director for operations, and our information technology manager. And then the rest are all public safety employees, police, the emergency management coordinator, and among civilian police employees, the chief communications officer. Have provided to you a survey of area cities. These are the usual cities that we check, including a few others that were, well, all of these are the usual ones on the Missouri side that we check. And as you can see, for the police department, it is not uncommon for some kind of requirement requiring police employees to be within a certain distance. But most of the cities that we spoke to do not have a requirement for general employees. And this is actually, we had done a survey a few years ago and noticed that it seems to be going in the direction of actually loosening restrictions on employees based upon what we saw a few years ago and what we're seeing now. So I would make that recommendation to you to make that change to our human resources policy.
Councilmember Kellogg.
Thank you. My question would be, how far back does this policy date? Do you have an idea?
You know, I'm not sure. I would say certainly preceding my tenure, which began in 2003. So we've had it for quite a while.
Okay. I appreciate you bringing this to attention. I would support loosening it up based on this, is that our major thoroughfares through the metropolitan area have all been upgraded in the last 25, 30 years. You know, the Grandview Triangle being the latest one. They've widened 291. 71 is now I-49. All of the major thoroughfares coming to Raymore have all been upgraded to basically freeway standards. We are no longer we are considered a rural community according to the post office, but in all reality, we are not rural anymore, other than, out in our Ward 4 where our really large lots are at, and some of Ward 3. So I would be in support of loosening it up, and I would hate to see us lose employees that, even our city manager speaks highly of because of that simple rule right there. In the real world, in the private world, I work with people that drive as far away as Racine, Kansas, further than Warrensburg, and out far west in Kansas, I further than Lawrence, So I don't think it's unreasonable to loosen this up. Now, I think it's a discussion of how far, let's think about this reasonably. How long will it take a person to get here? Now, public safety, yes, I agree with that and support that wholeheartedly. My next question would be is, does the fire department, our South Metro Fire Department, have a requirement, and what would that be also? Because those are emergency responders that affect us directly also. Okay.
I don't know if they have a county residency required, because a friend of mine actually serves on South Metro, and he lives in Lee Summit. But I think they have to live within so many minutes away from one of their stations, so it's a response time.
Yeah, and that's where I'm going with that right there is the response time. It'd be difficult to kind of nail that down in minutes away from, because that'd be subjective, but that's basically what we're talking about here, and I'd be curious about that.
Councilmember Moorhead.
I'm pretty open to a lot of these kind of changes. I don't wish to be punitive to anybody though that's an employee, but when I was looking at this over the weekend, if you pull out a map and actually draw the line, you can live in Warrensburg, you can live in Liberty, You can live in DeSoto, Kansas. I mean, 35 miles, this is not unreasonable. I'm not sure what the demand is to change it, but I mean, we have a pretty broad stretch as it is. I'm not sure what why that's unreasonable if somebody could live within that distance. I mean, I just drove in a few minutes ago from Topeka, and it wasn't that big of a deal for me. I don't understand necessarily the priority.
You know, I just don't think that if the employee is willing to spend the gas money and the time on the road, I don't know what the big deal is. I mean, even myself, at one point, I drove from Osawatomie, Kansas to 435 on Front Street every day, so I think it should be up to the employee if they want to do it.
Councilmember Hubach.
I feel that there's an old, there's an old expression about eating at the trough, and that's how I see this. I think that if they have any kind of authority to make any kind of decisions at all, that they need to live in Raymore. They need to follow the same decisions that the rest of. And the only we got it. I always seem to have trouble with that then. That if they're going to make policy decisions, they need to live in Raymore. And I feel very, very strongly that when I've talked to different people, they'd say, well, if the employees don't have to live in Raymore, why do the city council? We can get better councilmen from other places. And I'd say, yes, but you don't have that option. The state says they have to live in Raymore. Now, one of the things that also bothers me, if on our volunteers, if they move from one ward to the other, they have to give up their position. They have to, whether, it doesn't make any difference how good a person they were on planning and zoning or the park, whatever it is. If they've moved out of Ward 1 into Ward 4, they have to give up that position. It's a fact of life that, and nobody that works for the city of Raymore is guaranteed a job. And if they can't meet the qualifications, then they need to go somewhere else. I don't care how good they are or anything. But Raymore is entitled to have a few restrictions, and if they're not, I don't think 35 miles is unreasonable. And if they don't, if circumstances say that they can't live here, then that's just one of those things. They'll have to go somewhere else. Circumstances might say they had to live in California or someplace else. But I don't think that we should give up the right to have people live within 35 miles. I think that's plenty. Like you say, with transportation like it is, you can get to, and sometimes you can get 35 miles from someplace to the city here that I can out where I am just 5 miles away, depending upon what the traffic or anything is. I think we should leave it just exactly as it is. I'm not in favor of loosening it in at all. So we miss a few people, but there's always some good ones behind them.
Eric, just out of curiosity, what percentage of our employees now live within the city limits? Do we have an idea?
No, sorry, I haven't tried to compute that,
Okay.
so I don't know the answer.
Councilmember Kellogg.
Thank you. I just want to, I'll ask this in a question. It's a guided question, but I think I know the answer. Mrs. Hubach, you know, and in all due respect, she has said that, and it's off the topic, and I'm going to go there, but there's been some miscommunication or misunderstanding, I think, that I want cleared up and concise. As far as for our commissioners and people that serve on boards, if they have moved from one ward to another, that they can't serve, that's not necessarily true. In the past, we have had people serve in other wards that have not lived in that ward. The redistricting issue that we just dealt with here just recently, the last few years, threw that all into a tailspin where we had members that were in Ward 1 at one time, which Mr. Holman was, ended up over in Ward 3. The person that served on the planning and zoning at that time with, I think you were on the park board.
That made three of us on
Yes.
planning and zoning after the
Yes.
redistricting, and my term was the first one up, so that's
Yep.
why I
And-
led planning and zoning, and then was.
And we dealt with that through attrition, you know, but the fact of the matter is that when we wrote that that ordinance or that policy, the resolution, that in the case that we do not have a qualified individual in a ward, that the mayor has the ability to go to another ward to get one of those. Okay, now, as far as getting council members from another city, that's completely illegal. You know, that's against our charter. That's ludicrous. That only happens down further south. But am I correct, you know, with what I say, that a person in another ward is
Certainly,
able to?
certainly it's the case in the park board, and I'm not sure about planning and zoning, but in the case of the park board, a member can serve out their term if they move to another ward, even if they've moved out of the ward, and there's not exact equal representation as is the case with the park board, where you've got two from each ward and 1/3 person from the last ward.
Thank you.
Mr. Holman?
I'm in favor of the changes. Having worked for the city of Belton and going through this, when I started there, they required that you live within the city, then they loosened the restrictions to, I think, a 20 or 25 mile radius. Of course, I was a police officer, so it did, you know, we were going to come under the same restrictions anyhow, because you want obviously your public safety employees close. I think there's a benefit to us obviously from a human resources standpoint, like Eric's pointed out, with both retention and recruitment. Have good people that are willing to drive. As long as they're on time, which is a job standard issue, it shouldn't really matter unless they're on this list. I did have a question, probably more for my education, Eric, than anything else, but I agree with the names on the list. There were two positions that were not on there that surprised me a bit, and that was we stop at Chief Communications Officer. Our dispatchers, I would think, obviously they're a very vital link in our public safety network, and then the other one would be I don't know what the job title is, but our people that push snow when we get hit with a snowstorm is the other one.
Yes, sir. Well, you know, in the case of the dispatcher, I did consult the chief about that. I guess, you know, we've always got 2 people on at any time,
Okay.
and so if in an emergency, I think that position would always be staffed if something happened until the replacements got here. And in the case of the guys on the snow, you know, generally speaking, these things don't hit us by surprise. We're aware of them. We're watching the weather closely. We've done the scheduling already, so
Okay.
there isn't usually a case where, you know, they need to rush in quickly because we had already prepared.
Thank you.
Councilmember Abdullah.
I kind of lean the same direction as Mr. Moorhead. I feel like with the 35-mile radius, we have plenty of area for our employees to live. We have plenty of people in that area to choose from. So my preference would be to maintain that. I think that there is some value in keeping the standard the same across the board for employees. I know as a city, there have been a lot of different things that have been done to keep everything equal for all the city employees, not changing this for one department because we want to have a standard that's maintained across the board. So just in light of that past look at consistency, I think that that could be an important thing to think about. And then I also agree with Mr. Holman that if we do end up doing this, I thought communication officers might be an important one to have a little closer to the city. In my opinion, all department heads should be within 35 miles of the city. I think that's an important position. I wondered also about animal control officers. But I really do kind of agree with Ms. Hubach that if you're going to have the city valuable to you, you should live here, you should shop here, you should, make it a part of your life. And not that nobody gets to leave and we need to build a wall around the city or anything, but I know being a part of the community and having that vested interest in the city, I think, has value for our employees. Also a little bit concerned about drive time. I know there are a lot of people that drive long distances and can do a fine job, but also spending 2+ hours on the road every day, I think it would be hard to do that and not affect your work. So.
And I'd actually like to add on to that. I've actually spoke with a couple of constituents over the weekend, and they would actually prefer to see department heads live in the city and actually have a residency requirement for department heads. I'd be okay with loosening the restrictions on employees, but my feeling is that department heads should be, there should be a residence requirement. Councilmember Moorhead?
Again, for clarification, how many current employees live outside of 35 miles?
I don't know the exact answer. I don't think very many at all. This case was brought up because we did have one that had to move outside. He's within the radius that you indicated, sir, so I'd have to get on a map and see, but I mean, he's not as far out as Warrensburg. So if you think that's within 35 miles, I guess we'll take another look at the map. But his feeling was that he's outside the limit. We thought so too. So maybe it's not an issue if that's the definition, but I guess I'd be surprised to see that Warrensburg is 35 miles from Raymore. But
Well, the far western edge is, but again, plain meaning rule, you're looking at a straight line. You're not going off
Oh, no, I
of
agree.
MapQuest routes.
I agree, yeah.
And so, like I said, once you look at that and pull that out, it's the entire city of Kansas City. And I mean, with the exception of Platte City Water Tower. So we're not talking about limiting people to living just in Raymore. They can live anywhere around this city and still be within this radius requirement. And again, when I drew the line and I caught the edge of DeSoto, Kansas, and I drove through DeSoto, that's a pretty broad, 35 mile, 70 mile radius is a pretty broad stretch.
And it's 35 miles from is it the city center, or is it from any
it
edge
says
of the
City Hall. City Hall is what our policy says.
And it's as the crow flies, not by road.
Councilmember Hubach?
I agree with you on that. Department heads should live in Raymore because they're making policy, and they should live here and help. Where you live is where your heart is, and if your heart's not here in Raymore, then we're not getting the best from you that we could be getting. That's how I see it. I think, to me, it's a very personal thing, because I think Raymore's got a lot to offer. At one time, we didn't have much in the way of housing, but now we have just almost any kind of housing that you would want, so that is not a factor. And I can't understand why anybody wouldn't want to live in Raymore. We've got a lot to offer, and our school system's good, our fire department is good, our police is exceptional. We have no problems like that, so why wouldn't we be an attraction for people wanting to have jobs? The pay is good, the perks are good. I can't see why we would want to lessen anything just in order to have one or two out of, 100 people, and only 2 of them have expressed any dissatisfaction with Raymore. The one that moved to someplace else, they could have turned down another job offer or something and stayed here in Raymore. To me, Raymore's got to come first. And the employees and the city council, that's how I see it. And department heads means it because they're making policy decisions, and they should be here. Now, somebody that's only making like $10 an hour, no, that's different. But when you've got anybody making $50,000 or more, they should be living in Raymore.
Well, and keep in mind that it's the council that actually makes policy decisions and policy changes. And Councilmember Dugwad?
I just wonder, and I don't know, Eric, if you have the answer to this question, how often do people call interested in jobs and kind of say never mind because they hear about the residency requirement? Do you really think that's a deterrent as far as recruiting people or getting employees?
I think because we advertise that whenever we do a job, I think that people who live outside that area probably don't bother to apply. So it's hard for us to say how many might say, well, gee, I'd kind of be interested, but I see that they've got a 35-mile requirement, and I don't, for one reason or another, because I've got a spouse who lives with me, and they may live in a metro area. People live all over the place. So for whatever reasons, people may just decide that that isn't a requirement they can meet, so we don't hear from them. We don't get an application.
So we've never had someone interview or be interested in a job who said, oh, never mind, count me out because of that?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
Mr. Chip?
Well, I don't know how the rest of the council feels, but I know the way that I lean is that if we're gonna make changes, there's probably more dramatic changes I would like to make. But in light of that, you know, I think this is a situation where, at least in my mind, if it's not broke, don't fix it. So before I'd make any changes, I would prefer to just leave it be. But Councilmember Hubach?
I agree. Let's just leave it like it is until we find out there's a problem. If a problem, we can always, but right now, there's not one.
Eric?
I would like to perhaps suggest, if the council isn't inclined to make a change, which I can understand, I would ask that we might be, if we could go into executive session tonight to discuss this specific employee. And I'd like to ask if I could get the council's permission to allow dispensation for this employee, since this is what I consider a special circumstance. And that way, at least in this case, because right now we've got a situation where the policy is being broken, and one way or another, we need to come to a solution. And that would be fine with me if we could get there.
Councilmember Kellogg?
Thank you. That's exactly what I was just going to ask, and I'd make a motion that we go into executive session to discuss personnel matters tonight, whether it be now, if we need to do it now, or after. If we can do it after we conclude our discussion here.
Yes, yes, sir.
Okay. I'd request that.
Councilmember Abdullah?
I was just gonna ask one other question about, in all the years you've been here, is this the first time this has really come up? You've said twice, you know, we had the one employee who left because he moved, left for another position because he was moving, and then this one. Are these the only two in your?
Again, perhaps, you know, people don't tell us everything when they leave, but the case of the employee told us that that's anecdotal. This is the first instance that I'm aware of an employee, and credit to him, who said, I've moved outside of the 35-mile limit. I need to let you know that. I don't want to leave. Is there any way that I can continue to work here? That's the first instance of that I am aware of.
We have a motion on the floor to go into executive session. Do we have a second?
Second.
It's been motioned and seconded. Eric, would you call roll?
Yes, sir. May I just suggest, though, I mean, do you want to come back, or do you want to finish the discussion and then go into executive session only to adjourn?
I would prefer to finish this discussion, because let's get this off the table, and then we'll go through, if the council's okay with that, because we're about done with this discussion, I think, but.
I'm actually going to suggest the otherwise, only because if the discussion during the executive session could affect our position, and then we may want to come back and revisit, even if it's just briefly.
Councilmember Kellogg?
Okay, and I'm glad we got Joe here. Would we be in conflict with information that would come out of the executive session if we came back and well, we're not making a decision tonight anyway.
Right. And we won't use names when we come back.
Yeah.
This is just, you know, high-level discussion.
Okay.
All right, shall I call roll? Councilmember Boehner?
Yes.
Councilmember Abdullah?
Yes.
Councilmember Kellogg?
Yes.
Councilmember Hubach?
Yes.
Councilmember Holman?
Yes.
Councilmember Moorhead?
Yes.
Councilmember Stevens? Councilmember
Yes.
Westcoat?
Yes, we are adjourned into closed session.